Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. Returning to the program today, we have Professor Jeffrey Sachs, director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University and one of the world's leading economists. Professor Sachs, thank you for returning to join us here on Current Affairs.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Now, the last time you came on, we talked about where COVID came from. This time, I'd like to discuss U.S. foreign policy and how to achieve a lasting global peace and avoid catastrophic war, something that you talk a lot about and I don't hear many other people talking about these days. But I want to start with a question that a lot of people asked me last time why I hadn't asked you, because they were very curious. This question I'm a little curious about myself. A lot of my friends on the left want to have some variation on, are you the same Jeffrey Sachs? And what they meant by that was, for a long time, they sort of associate you, or your early career, with the neoliberal establishment, they might call it. They even might have read about you in one of Naomi Klein's books. And now today they hear you as one of the leading, most vociferous critics of establishment economics, of Washington foreign policy, and they want to know, how did you come to move from within to without? I assume there are, even if perhaps you don't accept the characterization that you have changed, there are certainly invitations I bet you would have received that you no longer received. And they wondered if you could tell us a bit more about the development of your own personal views.
Yes, but it's all a bit of a misunderstanding, I have to say.
Okay.
My intellectual formation was very much guided by the wisdom that I think is enduring wisdom of John Maynard Keynes, who was the great British economist in the first half of the 20th century. And Keynes wrote a book in 1919 that for me was one of the most important books that I ever read. And it was, of course, one of the most noted books in modern history. And that is The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Keynes was part of the British delegation to the Versailles negotiations that led to the Versailles Treaty. And he became a harsh critic of the Versailles Treaty, in particular, the reparations on Germany and the harsh peace on Germany. And Keynes warned that Europe would pay a very high toll, both in economic failures, but also in political backlash from the harsh peace. And of course, his description in 1919 became horrifically true in the 1930s. He said that a monster would arise if we continue this Carthaginian peace. That book had a big impact on me because as an early scholar of international finance, I viewed punitive conditions imposed on countries in crisis or countries in poverty to be inimical to the well-being of those countries, but also dangerous for the world. And so when I began my activities as an advisor to governments in 1985 in Bolivia, where I helped successfully to end a hyperinflation that at that point was the seventh most virulent hyperinflation in world history up until 1985, what I recommended to keep the new hard-won stability was a cancellation of Bolivia's debts. Now, that was not a neoliberal position. That was not an establishment position. It was my first foray into going into battle with the IMF, actually. And my position prevailed in the end. Bolivia became the first country in the Latin American debt crisis to get an outright substantial cancellation of its debts. When that succeeded, I was asked by a number of other governments to help them. and in particular, and for me, most transformatively in 1989, to help Poland, which was also in a deep financial crisis and a very deep debt crisis. And I arrived in Poland in April 1989 as an advisor both to the then government, still the communist government, and to the Solidarity movement. I arrived, not coincidentally, on the day that they signed an agreement, because those were the terms for me to arrive. I said, I'm only going to come if Lech Wałęsa is out of house arrest. And I became an advisor to Solidarity on June 4th, I believe it is, 1989. There was the first ever semi-democratic election in post-war Poland, and Solidarity won overwhelmingly, and I became their economic advisor and helped to devise a plan for them. And at the core of the plan was a cancellation of Poland's debts. This was not a neoliberal position. It was a Keynes-inspired position. I said, don't punish countries with unpayable debts. I believed then and now, and I said so in interviews, that I am a social democrat, philosophically. I am an admirer of Swedish social democracy. I said in an interview in 1989, I said, I'm not an admirer of Thatcher or Reagan's economic philosophy. And I'm a believer in Keynes's wisdom that we want international peace. It was on that basis that Poland got a very deep debt cancellation at my urging and recommendation, I want to say, because I was about the lone voice at the start of that for such a move. And it was the basis that I was asked to help Mikhail Gorbachev and then Boris Yeltsin in the Soviet Union and Russia. And I recommended the same. And the US flatly rejected it. And the US was uninterested in helping Russia. Now, all of this is to say the characterization of me as a neoliberal or as an agent of the US state or of the IMF is preposterous. It's laughable. It's a complete misunderstanding and misjudgment of what I believed then, what I said then, and what I believe now, and what I say now. What I believe is that we need international cooperation, we need international solidarity, we need peace, and we should not let economic crises fester or explode or become the basis of new conflict.
So you think all the Dr. Shock stuff was just unfair and a misunderstanding at the beginning?
Completely.
No.
And I knew it then. Media is a very funny thing. The Hall of Mirrors is a very funny thing. How people discuss things is a very funny thing. This is why also we have wars, we have conflict. People don't listen. They don't talk. They don't understand. You get things said, and one should not, and I never did, spend my life fighting battles with people who said things about me. There's too many interesting things to do in the world. But yes, it was a complete misunderstanding.
You mentioned there the end of the Cold War, and one of the themes that runs through your writing on foreign policy is that the end of the Cold War was a missed opportunity to forge a lasting global peace, a squandered opportunity in very large part attributable to the hubris and arrogance of US leaders. I wonder if you could elaborate on that, because it seems like a really, really critical point.
The Cold War ended in part because the Soviet system was a miserable system, and in part because Mikhail Gorbachev was a gifted and wonderful person who believed in peace. He ended the Cold War more than anybody else because he said, we're not going to shoot people that disagree with the Soviet Union. In 1989, a little known fact, which I happen to know firsthand, but most others don't know, is that Gorbachev helped to broker the entry of Solidarity into the Polish government. just the opposite of what you would expect of Soviet behavior. What Gorbachev wanted was peace, normalcy, cooperation. And he talked about a common European home, and he talked about a common European space from Rotterdam to Vladivostok. The US could not take yes for an answer. In our view, not mine, but in our government's view, we won the Cold War. We defeated the Soviet Union. We now had all the chips. We could do what we want. And that, of course, became the official doctrine, I would say, of the last year of the Bush administration, the tacit doctrine of Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton, and then later Hillary Clinton, the belief of the so-called neocons, and the strategy that was implemented from 1992 onward. And it was implemented with increasing hubris over time, and a more and more radical view over time that we would be the single unchallengeable power in the world. We would have what came to be called full spectrum dominance in every region of the world. We would call the shots. We would take out a number of governments, as General Wesley Clark has explained to us on numerous occasions in his discussions inside the Pentagon. And no one follows up on these things, by the way. But Wesley Clark was told, we're going to have several wars of choice because we're going to take out regimes that we don't like. And I just recently looked at a manuscript by a Pentagon insider who described also how the Israelis were pushing for the US to take out Saddam Hussein and to take out others that they thought were Israel's antagonists. And a lot of people in the administration felt, sure, we can do that. We're the only superpower in the world. Mm-hmm. So to my view, we completely blew it. And I've measured that recently by noting that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Doomsday Clock, which is a measure by one group of experts that I find very sound and subtle and sophisticated of how close we are to nuclear war, put the clock at the maximum distance from Armageddon, maximum distance from midnight in 1992 at 17 minutes from midnight, after having started the clock in 1947 at 7 minutes to midnight. So when the Cold War ended, we were safe. And what have we done since then? We're now 90 seconds to midnight, according to the Doomsday Clock. Boy, how stupid can one be to have so much power, so much opportunity, and to squander it so badly?
Now, importantly, you fault both Democratic and Republican presidents here. I was looking back at your 2018 book, A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism, and a lot of that is spent criticizing Donald Trump's foreign policy, his belligerence, a lot of the themes that you mentioned, the idea that the United States doesn't have to listen to anyone else, that we don't have to obey international law. It's a suggestion or not even that. You know, you certainly hear that quite openly from the right. But importantly, I mean, you are just as scathingly critical and have been of Joe Biden's foreign policy, which you call bankrupt and reckless. So perhaps you could elaborate there, because there are a lot of people who will say, yes, I see that in Donald Trump, but I don't see it in the moderate, centrist, pragmatic Joe Biden.
First of all, I'm an absolutely equal opportunity complainer. I think both parties are miserable. Both parties are in the grips of the military-industrial complex. Both parties get funded by the military-industrial complex. If anything right now, at a tinge, but it's only a close call, so I don't want to overemphasize it, I'd say the Democrats are more warmongers than the Republicans for the moment. But I don't want to emphasize that point because I think both are miserable, I have to say. So if we go back to 1993, Bill Clinton comes in, We've got 17 minutes from midnight. And what does Clinton start? And with Madeleine Albright and the other neocons in his administration, he starts NATO enlargement. Now, it's true, I want to emphasize to everybody, we really did truly promise that we would not move NATO 1 inch eastward. And it wasn't a semantic gimmick, it was a repeated point made by James Baker III, by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, and to the leadership of the Soviet Union and to Russia. Okay, now, Clinton immediately started to cheat and started to plan the expansion, which started with 3 countries of Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Russia was very unhappy, but not crushingly unhappy, because these were Central European countries. These are not countries on Russia's border, except for the technicality of Kaliningrad, but generally these are far from the mainland of Russia. But Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997 laid it out very clearly in an essay in Foreign Affairs called Strategy for Eurasia, where he said, okay, this is going to continue. We start here, we go on to the Balkans, we go on to the Baltic states, we go on to Ukraine and to Georgia, we surround Russia in the Black Sea, we render Russia a second-rate power, because without Ukraine, Russia's only a second-rate power. So the agenda was spelled out very clearly, and these things take years, and he said that the time for Ukraine's membership in NATO would be the second half of the aughts, 2005 to 2010. It was in 2008 that we made the invitation. George Bush's administration, Victoria Nuland famously, ambassador of Bush to NATO, to have NATO enlarged to Georgia and to Ukraine. So George W. Bush Jr. was neocon par excellence, but of course it was Cheney, who had been Secretary of Defense and now was Vice President, that pushed a lot of the agenda. Victoria Nuland's always there. That's one thing you could say. She's always part of it with any administration.
This is your colleague, Victoria Nuland.
Yeah, she is, absolutely, coming to teach diplomacy, quote unquote. Then in the Obama administration, it's more wars. I should have added, by the way, Bill Clinton had the idea of bombing Belgrade 78 days in a row. Oh my God. Talk about war in the center of Europe for absolutely completely irresponsible and internationally illegal actions. Okay, then we have Afghanistan, we have Iraq, then comes Obama. Obama does the same. He tasks the CIA with overthrowing Syria's President Bashar al-Assad in Operation Timber Sycamore. He assigns NATO the task of bombing and overthrowing Libya. By the way, I spoke with a world leader yesterday. We talked about this. Why Libya? Why bombing? Well, this was a very esteemed president, said, well, probably Sarkozy's personal feud with Muammar Gaddafi. Really? Yeah, probably. Well, why Obama? Well, hard to know, you know. This is how weird the situation is, and it's true. We went to Libya on completely false premises, as we did with Iraq, and unleashed mayhem in that country for the next 13 years, but also mayhem across the Sahel of Africa. All those weapons, all the jihadists, all the military capacity that had been part of the Libyan scene suddenly spreading across North Africa and the Sahel. Then Donald Trump, okay, very odd character in a lot of ways, but he dumps immediately the JCPOA, the plan with Iran for Iran's denuclearization in return for ending the sanctions regime and reestablishing normal trade relations. He dumps that. He starts the campaign against China, unilateral, by the way, internationally illegal tariffs and sanctions and everything else. Why? Because the US can do what it wants. Then comes Biden. I thought maybe we would have something a little more reasonable. Biden doubles down on everything. I think he's a politician. He's just a pal. So he sees that Trump made hay with anti-China. He's going to double down on that, which he has done. The Ukraine war could absolutely have been ended. It started in 2014 with a US-led or US-cooperated coup in February 2014. Biden was part of that back then. He was part of the coup. Victoria Nuland was part of the coup. Okay, they were already in it, but Biden had an exit ramp in 2021. Putin wanted one key point, and this is verified by everyone that knows on the inside, and it's been said by Jens Stoltenberg and by David Arakhamia, Zelensky's advisor, and many others. This was a war launched in 2022, or the expansion, because the war started 8 years earlier. But this was to stop NATO enlargement. And Biden could have stopped NATO enlargement and avoided this catastrophe. No, they thought we can whitewash on the map. We can break them, take them out of SWIFT, take them out of the international financial system, impose comprehensive sanctions, put in HIMARS, our wonder weapons. They really thought that this was just going to be great. It's going to be dandy. We'll take out Russia, then we go on to China, because that's the neocon fantasy world, that the ultimate contest is with China. And so Biden has played this all along. It's been a mess. It's been a disaster. It's been one miscalculation after another. But now we face a three-front debacle or imbroglio, however you want to see it. One is Ukraine, one is Gaza and the Middle East, and the third is over Taiwan and East Asia. Everyone badly managed.
Well, I assume that if I spoke to someone in the Biden administration and I presented what you've just said, they would treat me as if I'd portrayed the world upside down. And they would say that NATO is a defensive alliance, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was an aggression, that the Biden administration has done a very good job managing the Ukraine war, but keeping us out of a hot war with Russia, that we are committed to defending countries around the world against aggression, which is the source of the conflict over Taiwan, and that the same is true of Israel, which was attacked on October 7th. So how would you respond to someone who characterized the history that you've just laid out as a history of defense rather than offense?
Well, I would like them to do a little homework for maybe the first time if they really ask that, or if they know better, I would smile and pat them on the back and say how cute that is. But I would regard it as absurd, on substance. A good place to start is a very nice book, a PhD dissertation published as a book, Lindsay O'Rourke's book on covert regime change. This is really a good primer for people who have some confusion on these matters. US foreign policy is based on regime change because we're the empire of the world. And so when we don't like another government, we take it out. And she records the regime change operations between 1947 and 1989 because she's doing a scholarly study, and so she can open the archives for these earlier interventions. But there have been countless similar regime change operations since then. There are two kinds of regime change operations that the US engages in. One is open war, like overthrowing Saddam Hussein or bombing Belgrade, or bombing Libya, by the way, bombing Libya, Belgrade, and trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad and invading Iraq. These are not defensive operations. These are wars of choice. They're not defensive operations. But they're part of a history since 1947. In the Americas, it goes back actually to the beginning of the 20th century, to 1898. But these are regime change operations. That's American foreign policy. Everyone knows it around the world. And you know, one of the oldest jokes, maybe only semi-true, which is why is the United States the only country that's never had a coup? And the answer is because we're the only country that doesn't have a U.S. embassy. Now, we may have had a coup in 1963 with the assassination of JFK, but I'll put that issue aside. Everybody knows around the world the United States is not a peace-loving country. It's the empire of the day. And that's why they don't want it right on their border. They don't.
Well, so you've pointed out there the disjunction, the divergence between the United States image of itself and the image held by other powers.
I'd say most of the world, by the way.
Most of the world. I just wanted to bring up China here because you say in your book, China is being portrayed as a dangerously expansionist power, but this is the pot calling the kettle black, and in fact, it gets once again the picture entirely backwards, and in a very alarming way, right? Because we see both parties increasingly belligerent towards China in a way that leads to the buildup of armaments, of tensions, and the possibility of just an utterly catastrophic war in the long term.
China's a very fascinating case because it's one of the great civilizations of the world, and of course, one of the longest lasting civilizations. As a unified state, it's traditionally dated to 221 BC, when China became unified in a geography that is not so unlike China's geography today. Now, China did expand on its land base in part of its history, but China's boxed in, if you look at it geographically. To the north of China are the drylands or the steppe regions. China was repeatedly invaded from the north, from nomadic invaders like the Mongols. To the west of China is the Himalayas. That's a pretty steep barrier. To the south of China are the tropical rainforests, and they have been an effective barrier as well. China skirmished with Vietnam throughout history, but Vietnam is Vietnam, not China, because the tropical rainforest barrier held. And to the east of China is the ocean, is the Pacific Ocean. And China's remained pretty much in that rectangle, in that box for 2,000 years. China's statecraft never went for world colonies, never. China has not even been in a war since a 1-month war with Vietnam more than 40 years ago. The US, in the meantime, has been in perpetual war. China, interestingly, I find, if you think about its proximity to Japan and compare it, say, with France and Britain. France and Britain were at each other's necks for most of 1,000 years. They fought endlessly, sometimes centuries-long wars of competition. How many times did China invade Japan in 2,000 years? The answer is zero. Zero. Now, the Mongols ruled China briefly in the Yuan dynasty, and the Mongols tried 2 times unsuccessfully to invade Japan in 1274 AD and in 1281 AD. So this is 700 years ago. China never did. Interestingly, by the way, when Japan industrialized at the end of the 19th century, Japan invaded China. It invaded twice, in the 1890s and in the 1930s. What's my point? We're saying that China's the belligerent? Are you kidding? We've been at nonstop war. China has been not at all in war. If we just have normal relations and accept the fact that, thank goodness, China is experiencing an economic rebound after a disastrous century at imperial hands. Britain, France, the US, Japan. And now China's recovering from that. We should say hurrah. And now we can have good relations.
Well, what you said there, just to conclude here, indicates a thread that runs through your writing and talking on U.S. foreign policy, which is that you are a self-described internationalist. You believe in the possibility of countries working out their disputes diplomatically. I'm sure not always, but you believe that there is great potential for cooperation, for collaboration, for the building of mutual understanding. And in fact, that distinguishes you from some people might hear making what sound like similar criticisms, like the realists, like John Mearsheimer has had similar criticisms of the US policy towards Ukraine, but says we should pivot to the inevitable competition with China. That is not your vision. You believe that we are not doomed towards endless a terrible apocalyptic clash.
In fact, you used the same word JFK used in his June 10, 1963 peace speech, where he says, some believe that war is inevitable, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Man can solve man-made problems. And Kennedy goes on in a beautiful way, and I am a JFK Kennedy fan as what is possible. So John Mearsheimer and I are good friends. I admire him enormously. He is enormously decent, bright, smart. But I have one basic disagreement with him. His book is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. He's not offering a way out. He's saying tragedy is inevitable. And I say, John, it's a tragedy. We can't accept the tragedy. He said, Jeff, that's just how it is. I said, no, it's not that way. He said, yes, it is. And so that is our ongoing, our discussion between the two of us. I believe, by the way, also Kennedy said in his June 10, 1963 peace speech, he said, I speak of peace because of the new face of war, because he described what it means to be in the nuclear age. We've had wars throughout history, of course. Some would argue, I think John Mearsheimer would argue most likely, that war is inevitable in some way, that it's part of the human psyche, the human makeup, the politics, the anarchy of the international environment. But we live in an era when a war could end everything. I think it forces us to rethink, because you look back at past wars, and the one that is, most on the minds of the historians these days is actually the Peloponnesian Wars from 431 BC to 404 BC, when Sparta and Athens faced off against each other. And this has been used as a metaphor for the US being Sparta and China being Athens, the rising power, and the possibility or even inevitability of conflict. Now, the interesting thing about the Peloponnesian War, in addition to the great book that Thucydides produced about it, is that both Sparta and Athens lost by this terrible war that went on. They both ended their international political role because they were exhausted. What came next was Alexander the Great from Macedonia. And this is the real lesson. Wars are incredibly destructive. In a nuclear age, they could end everything. We have to be a lot more clever about our foreign policy. Today, by the way, you can read just about anywhere, but especially on the comment pages of our newspapers, people say, "Oh, don't be afraid of nuclear war. Don't be blackmail, nuclear blackmail, and the chances are low, and Putin won't do this. Oh my God, be afraid.
Hmm.
Come on.
Well,
We have to find our way away from the cliff.
yes, and you say be afraid, but one of the things I appreciate about the book in New Foreign Policy is that you conclude by laying out steps that can be taken. There is an internationalist foreign policy possible. You say we need to just live by the UN Charter, commit to international organizations, follow international law, believe in it. I mean, in some ways, we are in this situation in part because we have declined to show any leadership on following the rules that we believe that if everyone followed, we would avert the catastrophe that many see on the horizon.
Well, that's precisely right. And we're told you're a sap if you believe in those rules. No one else is going to follow them. It's an old story. Many people will be familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, the idea that cooperation is the best, but there's a temptation to cheat, and therefore cheating by both sides is inevitable, is the quote rational equilibrium of the prisoner's dilemma. It's just disastrous for the two prisoners. It's disastrous for two superpowers that are in a nuclear face-off. So the question is, how can one have cooperation? Now, President Kennedy in the peace speech said even great powers can be counted on to observe treaties that are in their interest. And he said, and only those treaties that are in their interest. Ronald Reagan also wisely said, trust, but verify. So don't have blind trust, but trust, because without trust, you can't cooperate, but verify as well. So the idea is, let's think how to avoid nuclear Armageddon and think about how we can build the relations rather than our current mode, which is to say the other side is evil and perfidious and nothing can be done about it except war. This is what we're really being told, and it's wrong.
Well, that's quite a positive note. So let's leave it there. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, thank you so much for returning to join us on Current Affairs today.
Great to speak with you. I really appreciate it.